Then let's get started. So our PEPSS seminar today will be on making big money work for the climate transition, what we know and what we don't know. So we have the pleasure to have two great speakers today. Assistant Professor Saphira Rekker and Brett Morgan from Market Forces. So I first would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodianship of the land on which we meet. And I pay respect to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connection to country. And I also recognize the valuable contribution to Australian and global society. So a few things before we start. So the presentations will be recorded for later use. So if you don't wish to be recorded, please just leave your video turned off and do not post in the chat instead. And also the edited recording will be available soon. So if you want to watch it later on, you can go to the PEPSS page on the Social Change Lab. And also, if any one of you is not on the PEPSS mailing list, feel free to email the email that you see below in the slides, and we're happy to add you to the mailing list. All right, so I would like to first, I have my pleasure to introduce Dr. Saphira Rekker, who is a senior lecturer in sustainable finance here at the University of Queensland. And Dr. Rekker is a world-leading scholar in corporate Paris compliance measurement and develops science-based emission reduction methodologies. Her research focuses on tools to measure and verify the efficacy of decarbonization commitments by corporations and financial institutions. So please welcome me and give a warm welcome to Saphira. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Christoph. All right. Big topic. Making big money work for the climate transition. Okay, so what I thought I'd do first is to go sort of to Finance 101. So up until this year, because I got a Rekker scholarship, I was teaching finance, first-year finance course, and the first thing we talk about is what is actually the objective of a firm in society? What is the purpose of a firm and society, or business? What is the objective of the firm? And so that's a key. I'll touch upon that in the next slide a little bit. Then another key concept in finance is the time value of money. It's meaning that money doesn't have the same value right now as it has in a year because we can earn interest on this. Very sort of simple concept, but very big implications for how we value the future, in a sense. How do we value the future? Now, the third concept is risk and return. So everything in finance is about maximizing return and minimizing risk. So there's a risk-return often trade-off. If we are to take more risk, we want to be compensated with that with a higher expected return. So these are some key concepts that we have in finance. And based on that, we can value financial instruments, and we can analyze how financially feasible, for example, a project is. So first, the role of business. Now, most finance textbooks will be based on this first one. Okay, the goal of a firm and society is to maximize shareholder wealth. Shareholders own the company. You're supposed to maximize their profits. That's what you should be doing. You shouldn't be spending money on anything socially responsible because the government should be taxing and the government should be doing these things. And there's a democratic process for electing the government. And that's how we should be exercising our socially responsible beliefs. And the business shouldn't be sort of bothering with that. Like, we shouldn't be spending the money that a business makes on, on charities, which, to some extent you may agree with. Like, if I have my money invested in a renewable energy company and they want to sponsor the local ballet, I don't find that important. So why are they spending my money, right? So there's some valid aspects in there. But also some big shortcomings. It's very short term as well. Like, maximize shareholder wealth on what sort of time frame? Often this translates into the short term. So you want to see profits in the short term. But there are other theories to different business purpose theories that have gotten more attention in the last couple of decades as well. So I have Freeman saying, well, actually, no, a business should be creating value, which is beyond wealth, for a bunch of stakeholders, not just the shareholders, but also the consumers, the government, its suppliers, its employees. It should be creating value for all of these stakeholders in the best way possible. Then we had Lynn Stout from Cornell University. She wrote a book on the shareholder value myth. And she's saying, well, first of all, there's not one shareholder. We all have different time horizons, right? We have short-term time horizons and long-term time horizons. And shareholders care about more than just money. We care about our families, we care about our jobs, many care about the environment, all of these things. So maybe we should be focusing on satisfying multiple objectives. And actually, she takes it, she's a law professor. She says, actually, this is not because often say, well, by law, companies are supposed to maximize shareholder wealth. It's a very complex topic. But yes, often in legislation, it is saying the managers of the firm have to act in the best interest of the company, which often means the people that own the company, which is the shareholders. And then we have Hart and Zingales. Hart is actually a Nobel Prize winner at Harvard. I have communicated with him a few times about this because I have it in my course and I'm writing this case study. And anyway, he's a very nice person. And he wrote this piece on the goal should be to maximize shareholder welfare. So welfare is much broader, again, than just wealth. And it might not be efficient to Friedman's proposal as, okay, make as much money as you can, pay it out as dividends, and then the shareholders can do with that money what they want to do. But Hart is saying, well, that might not be efficient in some cases. For example, if most shareholders don't want guns to be sold, but it's in Dick's Sporting Goods' best interest to sell the guns, make the profit, pay out the dividend, and then for the shareholders to go, okay, look, I'm going to use that money to now lobby against guns. That's very inefficient. So actually, it's more efficient in the first place if Dick's Sporting Goods is not going to sell these guns in the first place. So he's sort of making that argument. Okay, so that's sort of setting that landscape. So now what is the role of finance? What should the financial industry sort of, what are different ways of investing, we can say? So we sort of have conventional investing or conventional finance, just maximize financial return. Again, often this is in the short term. And then we also have something called economic social governance factors integrated. So often we talk about ESG, so we have to consider economic and social and governance factors in our decision making. However, we know that this actually should be environmental. Sorry, I see that for the first time. Should be environmental, not economic social governance. We know that these have financial risks, right? If we are polluting very heavily, that is a financial risk. You could be fined, or if you're not treating your employees well, all of these have financial risks in them. So actually considering these factors in itself doesn't mean it's contrary to maximizing financial return, right? So when you hear ESG, some might think, oh yeah, they're doing something good, right? We're including environmental. No, but like if you just, we call this material. So they're material risks, meaning we consider them to the extent that we think they have a financial impact. Okay, so that's ESG. And then we have socially responsible investing. So social return, that's a social return on investment where you're actually starting to balance financial returns with social and often also environmental outcomes. Then a lot of increase in recent years actually in this one, in impact investing, where actually the focus is first on creating social and environmental outcomes, and then secondary return, and then on the entire end of this spectrum, we could just be giving money, philanthropy, which is just maximizing social and environmental outcomes. So a bit about the time value of money. So time value of money is the concept that money available now is more valuable than the same amount later, because we can put that money to work or pay off a loan. We all, want our salary now rather than later. Otherwise, we have to borrow money to pay our rent, which is expensive. So this is a very, very key concept in finance. So we want $100 now, not 100 in 1 year, because we could put this to use. Now, the further money is in the future, the less it is worth. So that implies that the further it's in the future, the less it's worth today. Because this $100, had we had 95 today and we would have invested it at, say, 5%, we would have 100 in a year. So that the implication of this is that the further something is in the future, the less it's worth to us today. Then we have interest rates depend on risk. So basically means the higher the risk, the higher the interest rate is that we want to receive, which is actually exacerbating this first one here. So the further something is in the future and the higher the risk, the less it's worth to us today. So we're willing to pay or sacrifice today. Something happening in 70 years, with a high risk, we're willing to pay almost nothing for today if we are applying these principles. So this has been talked about in the climate context by economists already a decade ago, more than a decade ago. So the benefits of reducing climate damage from climate change will come later, many of them to later generations of Australians. In fact, there will be more and more benefits for later and later generations. So we can't use traditional finance principles of the discount rate. So that's what finance people want to do, right? We want to look at, okay, how much is it what are the cost implications going to be in the future? Let's discount them to now. And then what should we do with that? So this was already in 2011, the Garner Review, which was an economist, saying we can't use this discount rate. Because it basically means that if we know that, continuing using fossil fuels, for example, would give lots of benefits now, but would cause the extinction of our species in the half of a century, the calculations would pretty much tell us to do it. So that's a big problem we have in finance. So there's been a lot of talk in the last decade at the COP and at others of the role of private finance in tackling climate change. So a lot of call Mark Carney, was ex-governor of the Bank of England. So there's some big figures in finance that have been speaking up, saying, look, we have to adjust business models. We have to start doing things differently. But how do we do that, right? One of the ways is to increase the amount of information we have on what companies are actually doing. So that's what the EU has been doing. So the EU has been working on a taxonomy. They have a taxonomy which basically classifies an activity. Because if we are to believe the companies, they're all very green, they're all very sustainable, they're all the best. But we need some, rigorous guidelines of what that is. So the EU developed this classification system of a taxonomy. These taxonomies are now being expanded worldwide. So we have one in Australia. We have one under development in Australia on the technical taxonomy advisory group, expert group. So that's in development, but most of them are actually based on the EU and trying to put it in a more national context. Also, the EU has labels for what a green financial product is, because again, products are also greenwashed. Like if you have to believe this is a green bond, this is, everything is green in a market. Low carbon index, zero carbon index, what do they actually mean, right? Not only that, the EU also is introduced as clarifying what are the duties regarding to sustainability, because right now the duties of asset managers and institutional investors is to sort of demonstrate a financial risk to its clients, right? To us, to disclose, you always say like, oh, the disclaimers of, this is the sort of like financial risk and all of that. But maybe we should also be, the clients, we shareholders should also be informed about other metrics, like what implications does this have for the environment and for our social systems. Strengthening the transparency and incorporating climate risk into banks and financial institutions. So this last element of climate risk has become a huge topic since, you could say, 2017 with the rise of the TCFD. So the TCFD was set up by the Financial Stability Board, which is a very, again, significant sort of global organization trying to maintain this financial stability. And that was led by Michael Bloomberg, big figure. Bloomberg is a big terminal with all the data on all the companies. And it was there to increase the transparency, to enhance market efficiency. And market efficiency, another big topic in finance, and to make economies more stable and resilient. So this figure here is sort of what now is, you can see a foundation of how the financial industry talks about climate risk. So climate risk can be categorized into transition risk and physical risk. So physical risk is the actual impact of climate change. So extreme weather events, like both acute and chronic. So how does the climate changing impact, what financial impact does that create? But also the transition risk. So us transitioning to a net zero economy has risk. So we have to consider those. So there might be more carbon pricing. There are more technologies arising that compete with, for example, fossil fuels. So fossil fuels may become, if we are transitioning, they will become less financially attractive. Market change, so also consumer preferences and reputation. So, and litigation is part of that as well. So reputation, if companies are not doing the right thing, that can damage reputation, which has a financial impact, right? It's also clarifying opportunities that come with the transition, which is that, we can have more different products, we can offer new products, new markets, etc. So some core elements of this TCFD report is a way to, disclose what a company or financial institution is doing. At the very core of that is metrics and targets that a company sets. So the TCFD is already outlining different elements that this should be covering, like whether the target is absolute or intensity-based, different timeframes, the base year. So how do we set, what do you need to disclose on the metrics? And then we had, this is, a few years ago now, but Larry Fink is the CEO of BlackRock, who's basically the largest asset manager in the world. So they manage a significant amount of money globally. And he writes a letter to CEOs every year because they basically invest in every company. So if he says, "Dear CEO," it basically means it goes to every CEO of every publicly traded company in the world. And in that, he said, we're going to ask you to disclose a business plan that is aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. So well below 2 degrees, disclose the line with the Paris Agreement, but not specifying what does that mean? What does it mean to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement? Now, that's been my research focus for a while now. So this was 2017. I just want to highlight, don't get scared when I go to the next slide. So all I want to say with this is that this TCFD that was in 2017 has now transitioned to is now a key input of something called the ISSB, which is an International Sustainable Standards Board, which falls on the IFRS. So, and In finance, business and finance, we have the IFRS, which is a global standard for reporting balance sheets, income statements, all of that. So it's like the international governing body for that. And they now not only have this financial disclosure sort of guidelines, but also one for sustainability. So again, this ISSB IFRS S2 is based on the TCFD. So we're continuing this, you know, it's just gotten bigger and bigger, you could say. So these guidelines are great, but they have very little guidance of what it means. So it's asking for metrics to be used to measure progress towards these targets. So it's not only targets, right? Because we see a lot of companies setting targets, but what we really want to know is the progress against these targets and how legitimate are these targets in the first place, etc. And it's also asking questions of the amount and percentage of assets or business activities vulnerable to climate-related transition risk. That's a very big question. Like I would, you know, I've worked in this field for a while. I would not know how to begin answering that question if I was a business, right? So again, also just to highlight, this whole question continues. Companies now have to disclose the metric used to set the target, the objective of the target. All these things, the base period, very much in line with TCFD earlier, and how the latest international agreement on climate change, including jurisdictional commitments that arise from that agreement, has informed the target. So again, how does it align to the Global Power Agreement? Great, but again, how do you do this? Right? So I've been looking at this for a while now, and it's not an easy task to compare a company against the goals of the Paris Agreement. So this is started my PhD 10 years ago, finished 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and I'm still very much working on that. But yeah, trying to like quantify how aligned a company is with the goals of the Paris Agreement isn't easy. So done a few studies on that. First, looking at the current landscape. So what investors often use is the sustainability rating scheme. So they use MSCI and they're behind a paywall and they're using these sort of methods. But we asked the question, do these, you know, these ratings that they use, do they actually capture performance against climate goals? This was 2017 with the study, they didn't. There's definitely been improvement in that space. Probably should have a follow-up study on that. But as far as we can see, I still haven't seen, you know, really sort of science-based, but science-based, I mean peer-reviewed sort of methods on how to do this. So then we had the rise of the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative in 2015. Then they had an earlier method was published, but it was just focused on scope 1 and 2 emissions. I know that probably doesn't tell you much, but it basically means that you can't apply it to fossil fuel companies because it's their scope 3 emissions. It's the actual use of their product that matters. So we came up with another method to just look at how we do this for fossil fuel companies. That led me to be invited onto the Science-Based Targets Initiative Oil and Gas Technical Working Group. That went for 2 or 3 years, then it fell apart. And there were companies on that. There were fossil fuel companies on that technical working group. They couldn't make it work. I'm always hesitant when I'm being recorded. But look, they couldn't make it work. They have restarted the process. I had a big I don't want to say fight, but I put up a bit of a fight because there were only, out of 35 people, there were only 3 academics on there. And I'm like, well, you're calling yourself Science-Based Targets Initiative. I think we should have at least a third of people that are scientists in the field. And now we have a lot more. So they've listened and we have a lot more. And I have to say I'm quite happy with the process. So then we published another paper basically looking at how there are some initiatives, including the Science-Based Targets Initiative, how they are measuring Paris compliance or Paris alignment. And we found some shortcomings, and that led us to write a paper. Okay, let's set some conditions and requirements of what Paris alignment actually means. And then we applied that in a paper last year, again, to fossil fuel companies. So what time is it? I'm running out of time, so I will skip through this. So we basically set up some conditions of how to do this. So bottom line is we compared it to a few initiatives out there. And we basically say, well, it's most important that we're tracking cumulative emissions over time, since a base year that aligns with the underlying decarbonization pathway. So we had an initiative here that is comparing it just to the sectoral average. Then we have the Science-Based Targets Initiative and Act that basically allow companies to reset a target even though they haven't met their prior one. So they're basically saying, well, you could have set a target here in 2014 according to a certain method. You didn't make it. This was the solid blue line here. This is your actual intensity. So you can start again, and now you can follow this gray line. Now, I think everyone can see that cumulatively, that's not the same. And, you know, we have to do these things properly. If we're talking about the carbon budget and Paris alignment, it needs to at least add up. So we basically say, well, actually, this company should have been on this solid green line here based on its market share if we apply this methodology. It was on this line here, the blue one, and therefore to make up for it, it should follow this purple line here to stay within its budget. So then we can have a bunch of metrics. Actually, that's not on this. So we had a bunch of metrics to then assess their progress, right? So this is then converting this intensity into cumulative carbon emissions. So actually this company is not on track, as we saw from this intensity. How much is it not on track? Well, in this case, it was 1.17, so that's emitted 17% more than what would be considered Paris aligned under this particular methodology using this particular pathway. Just to say that clearly, because there's not one Paris compliant pathway, there are many different ones. So we basically put a bunch of metrics. Okay, well, this is how we can start assessing a company. Then we can map companies, how they are performing. So we assessed electric utility companies in Australia. And we also projected forward. So we actually found that Origin, for example, even though it wasn't on track right now, if it we modeled it forward using based on their expected closure dates, if they actually close their assets as they had reported to the AMO, and they would replace them only with renewable after, so they would not have any more fossil fuel-based power plants, they would actually be on track and they would actually stay within their budget. So we can do this bunch of analysis. Right, then we looked at how can we apply this method to fossil fuel companies. Now the most significant, so we can assess them, we can make nice graphs to evaluate how they're doing, but the most significant difference of this study is that we actually looked at a bunch of different pathways. And there are many different pathways. We just chose 3. But we wanted to highlight the underlying assumptions of these pathways, because companies can say, well, look, I'm aligning with a 1.5 degree pathway, and they technically maybe are. But that pathway that they're choosing with very high reliance on fossil fuels will have to go paired with very high levels of CCS. And we want to make that very transparent. So that is basically, and I don't know if that's the next slide already, but yeah, that's basically what we want to highlight. And I just spent 3-4 months in Europe with the modeling groups that do this modeling. So they have hundreds of these pathways, and they all have different assumptions on technological developments, you know, CCS, population, all of these. So the plan is to keep working with them to sort of uncover what are the most important underlying assumptions that we should be making clear when we're assessing companies against, but same as for countries. So I got an ARC DECRA. What that DECRA is really about is to try and build a platform to assess companies and actually, I have no idea what this means here. I realize this is actually an old slide. But this is sort of the vision of the platform, where we want to assess the company's performance, show their pathway. So just in the last couple of months, I also met someone at Oxford who's working at projecting these emissions forward, because that's not always really easy to do. So I want to combine all these different researchers that are doing all, really cool, interesting stuff on this topic, to combine it into one platform that investors and society at large can use to actually assess under what conditions and what assumptions companies are aligned with what. I'll skip over this. So just some shortcomings of what we see right now in sort of greenwashing, you know, the net zero announcements. What we see as goals way too far in the future. Large part of emissions are not included. And there's often reliance on unproven technology. So again, we want to try and uncover that. So quickly, last year I proposed some resolutions, some of you might know, for UniSuper. Wasn't successful in the end. I was just talking about it before here in the room. I sort of, you know, I'm not going to propose them again. I feel like I've, you know, sort of at some point you have to choose your battles. And I don't think the battle with UniSuper is what I'm going to win. If we have 1,700 signatures of lots of prominent people saying that they want this, but, you know, basically UniSuper doesn't care and just say, look, this might endanger our performance test in the next 3 years, and therefore we can't do this, then yeah. So what you can do, I'd say create the risk. So how do we create that transition risk for companies? Well, it's obviously through our voting, but our consumer choices, litigation, and reputation, what of course market forces, Brett et al. Are working on. And pushing for long-term thinking. So willing to actually sacrifice in the short term. Say, look, actually, I don't care what in the next 3 to 5 years, especially for younger people having their money in pension funds. You know, I don't like, I'm happy to lose money the next 10 years if we are, you know, because it's, again, climate change is a long-term issue. And some sacrifices in the short term will pay off greatly in the long term. And then my job is to critically analyze commitments and call for action. So really, that's the Are You Paris Compliant work. We have a website, areyoupariscompliant.com, that is far from complete, but that's eventually where we want to have the platform. Hand it over to Brett. Sorry, I think I went a bit over time, but.
All right, thank you so much, Saphira. Thanks so much. And now I have the pleasure to introduce Brett Morgan, who's an asset management and superannuation funds campaigner at Market Forces. And Brett is also a climate campaigner with a background in community organizing and financial services. He works and focuses on holding superannuation funds accountable for their investments and engaged with companies that impact climate change. Please welcome Brett.
Thanks very much for that, Christoph. Are you happy for me to give my presentation now, then comment on Saphira's afterwards?
Yes, absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay, just bear with me while I share my screen. Okay, are you able to see that, folks?
Yeah. Yes.
Wonderful. All right, so firstly, yeah, thank you very much for having me here today. It's really exciting to come and talk to you about our work and also hear about the wonderful work that Saphira is doing. To kick it off, I'll just say that, look, I'm a climate campaigner, right? I'm not a financial advisor, so you know, just to note that, and I won't be recommending any specific financial products in this presentation, of course, but just to note that nothing that I say in this presentation should be used for or relied upon as a substitute for professional financial advice. So just a bit of a caveat there. But look, a little bit about me to start with. I've worked for Market Forces for about 3.5 years now, and I lead the Superfund campaign. So that involves working with Superfund members and other key stakeholders, developing campaign strategies to push for an end to investments in companies that are building new coal, oil, or gas projects. And that also involves some, you know, direct engagement with institutional investors as well. It involves holding super funds accountable for their climate claims and also calling out the greenwashing, as Saphira mentioned before, right? So a big focus of our work in particular is on investor accountability. So that includes scrutinizing super funds for failing to adequately manage climate risk through their stewardship strategies and their policies, as well as tracking how they vote at company AGMs, etc. So super funds over recent years have been increasing their increasingly making climate claims and net zero commitments, but not backing it up with the adequate action to meet those commitments. Before we get stuck into the substance of my presentation, though, I'll just give a quick overview of market forces and who we are as an organization. So we're an environmental campaigning organization, and we believe that the banks, super funds, and governments that have custody of our money should be using that to protect and not damage the environment. Now, our work focuses primarily on the biggest threat to a stable climate, which is the companies expanding the scale of the fossil fuel industry, as well as the financial institutions that are willing to still support those companies. We've got a program of work here in Australia that's focused on the major fossil fuel producers and their financial backers like banks and super funds. But we also have a program of work that's been developed over the past few years in Asia, which is targeting companies over there that have massive coal and gas power expansion plans, as well as their financial backers. So yeah, a lot of previously we've been critiqued for focusing entirely on the supply side, but actually there are some companies that are proposing massive new LNG to power facilities in Asia, for example, that are effectively artificially inflating supply in certain places. So we also focus on those kinds of companies as well. And what that means is we actually have campaigns all across Australia, as well as places like Japan, Indonesia, and Bangladesh. And here's a lovely picture of all of us in the same place together from last year, which is quite nice. So our work at Market Forces exposes the institutions that are financially financing environmentally destructive projects. And we work with tens of thousands of bank customers and super fund members and shareholders and community members from all across the globe to hold these institutions accountable for what they do with our money. And a big part of this work involves preventing investment in activities that exacerbate climate change, like the expansion of the fossil fuel sector. So we cover quite a variety of corporate campaign areas and finance industry subsectors like banks, super funds, asset managers, other institutional investors, insurance companies, listed companies, just to name a few, of course. There are sometimes more. Now, in the spirit of this presentation and given the theme of our seminar, I figured it's best to start with fundamentals of what we know about fossil fuels finance and the energy transition at a pretty high level. And so really there are only a small group of companies globally that are responsible for the most climate damage and increase in global emissions. And that is the companies that are building new or expanded coal, oil, and gas projects. So we're currently undergoing the biggest social, economic, and technological transition in living memory. And the climate science is absolutely clear that the production and use of fossil fuels must begin declining steeply if we are to have a shot at meeting the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree temperature goal. But financial institutions around the world are still more than happy to bankroll the companies that are undermining that very goal. Saphira mentioned before, there are obviously multiple pathways to Paris alignment, but these fossil fuel companies are engaging in some pretty serious greenwashing and claiming that they're Paris aligned while relying on scenarios that are actually quite often have assumptions around an impossible uptake in carbon capture and storage, for example. So that's a pretty important thing to note. But the good news is the success of the divestment movement globally has actually had a pretty big influence here, with institutions around the world collectively worth more than $40 trillion having taken at least some steps to divest. I'll say that number again, $40 trillion. That's a pretty big figure. And look, just 2 days ago, actually, we had some really great news whereby Australia's largest bank, Commonwealth Bank, has finally cut, all but cut ties with major gas companies like Santos. So for a long time, banks in Australia have been willing to provide what's called general corporate finance to companies, which isn't tied to any specific project, but just finance for those companies to do with what they will. And obviously, if you're providing general finance to an oil and gas company, it's pretty clear that they're going to use that on their oil and gas projects. And so it's really great to see CommBank take this step and actually, cut ties with companies that are oil and gas companies that are continuing to expand and undermine global climate goals. And this is a far cry from where this bank was only a couple of years ago as well. I've also got here a little graphic around a campaign we're running at the moment. So UniSuper is one of the largest, well, the largest shareholder in a gas pipeline company called APA Group, of which the fund owns around a 10% stake. And APA Group is a company that is best placed really to build the gas infrastructure connecting to the Beetaloo Basin, which is a massive new frontier for fracking in the Northern Territory and a huge, huge threat to our climate. And so we're actually asking UniSuper to take a position against this development because APA could actually be the key to unlocking the Beetaloo Basin, and which is something we absolutely cannot afford if we are to have a shot at meeting the Paris goals and ensuring that we're doing our bit to keep emissions in check. So I mentioned before that there are really just a small group of companies around the world doing the most climate damage, and we've actually quantified the most damaging companies specific to listed companies on share markets globally. So the Climate Rekkers Index is a big report that we publish each year, and we've been doing so for a few years now. So, out of the tens of thousands of companies that our super funds can invest in, it really is just this handful that are doing most of the damage. And we've actually identified 190 of them from around the world in fossil fuel subsectors, including coal, oil and gas extraction and power generation, as well as LNG infrastructure development, such as gas power plant developers or import and export terminal developers. And that includes some of Australia's most notorious climate pariahs, like oil and gas companies Woodside and Santos, and coal miner Whitehaven Coal. And what we've done is we've actually looked at the top 30 super funds investments in those companies, and we've actually analyzed their holdings against this index. And based on that analysis, we've estimated that there could be around about $150 billion of Australians or of members' retirement savings invested in these 190 companies across the super industry, which is a significant show of financial support from super funds for the expansion of fossil fuels. Look, this is quite significant because the projected emissions from the fossil fuel expansion plans of just these 190 companies could actually eat up, it's 129 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that is equivalent to just over half of the global carbon budget for keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees. So it really is clear that it's just this small group of companies that are most responsible for the climate damage. And unfortunately, nearly every single Australian super fund invests its members' retirement savings in many of these companies. In fact, every single one of the top 30 super funds in Australia invests in at least some of them. And this is pretty big because those 30 funds account for the overwhelming majority of assets in the market, in the super fund industry. And unfortunately, again, I'll get to this in a little bit, but super funds just aren't doing their bit to rein in the expansion plans of these companies and actually live up to their own climate claims. Here are a few key findings from this year's report. So we found that every single super fund, every one of those top 30 I just mentioned, has increased its investments in these companies over the past 2 years. That's both in dollar terms and as a proportion of their share investments. Now, super funds also effectively own a portion of the emissions from all of the new fossil fuel projects planned by companies they're invested in. And our analysis actually found that just 3 companies, so that's Woodside, Santos, and Whitehaven, are by far the biggest contributors to those emissions for the average super fund. And so that's a clear list of companies that super funds ought to be or Australian companies anyway, that super funds ought to be focusing their efforts on. The third key finding here is that we have found that for every dollar invested in clean energy companies, and that is companies on the Bloomberg Goldman Sachs Global Clean Energy Index, super funds have $5 invested in the Climate Rekkers Index. So it's pretty big disparity. And, there are several reasons why investments in clean energy companies, especially listed ones, hasn't taken off, including the smaller pool of capital available. But overall, it's not really painting a nice picture for members in particular who expect their funds to be living up to their climate claims. Now, I will say as well that the growth in super funds exposure to these climate wreckers can be explained in part by the company's growth on the broader market. But the key concern is that there are an increasing number of super funds setting net zero targets and making climate commitments, but there has been no identifiable trend of funds phasing out these filthy companies, let alone even having plans to phase them out. There are very few, if any, commitments to actually end their investments in these companies or have a pathway to ramp up the pressure on them to end their expansion plans, resulting in divestment. With that, I'll move on to what we actually don't know about the transition. So I'll caveat this by saying that I've put these 2 questions here, right? I've proposed a couple of questions to frame up the next part of my presentation. And I think, while we can answer them in theory, we have never transitioned an entire global economy like this before, and we're actually yet to experience how a decline in fossil fuel production and use will actually happen. So the first question here, there are a lot of uncertainties around how the market might react to particular issues, such as stranded assets, right? All of this fossil fuel infrastructure that already exists, as well as the infrastructure that companies are planning to build or currently building, that's going to be worthless in a Paris compliant world at some point. And so, understanding how financial markets will react to that is a pretty interesting question. And the second one is, I'll actually dig into this a little bit more in the next part of my presentation, as we do have some sort of theories and answers around the role of fossil fuel companies in the transition. But again, it's just a matter of what that looks like. So we know what needs to happen to ensure a stable climate. We just don't know exactly what it will look like. And look, I've put this chart up here on the right-hand side of the slide because that's based on some analysis that for an investor briefing we published a little while ago. And this is looking at the annual forecast from between 2012 and 2023 of the International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook, and their forecast of the solar photovoltaic additions. And so, as you can see, every single year for the past decade, the IEA has underestimated the uptake in solar PV. And so I think that's just, to me, that really sort of encapsulates the uncertainties, as well as the just how quickly the energy transition and the technology is accelerating, beyond the ability of the global energy experts to be able to predict it. So I'll talk a little bit about Woodside Energy and explore those questions through our work on on this particular Australian climate pariah. So Woodside is Australia's largest oil and gas producer. It has gotten significantly bigger in recent years with its acquisition of BHP's petroleum business back in 2022. And Woodside's planning on building some major new projects, including the Scarborough gas field and Pluto LNG processing facility over in WA. It also has, not too long ago, sanctioned a new oil field in the Gulf of Mexico. There are a few other projects on the books that haven't reached the final investment decision yet, but the company is showing all signs of progressing them, such as the Browse gas field in WA, which is another massive climate threat. And Woodside has actually recently made a couple of new acquisitions in the last couple of weeks as well. So the company bought a new LNG business in the US, which owns a development opportunity for an LNG export facility. So Woodside says that they're hoping to take the final investment decision on that project early next year. And if that project does reach financial close and operates at full scale, that actually has the potential to double Woodside's emissions, which are already significant. And yeah, look, every single super fund in Australia effectively invests in Woodside, aside from a very small handful of ethical funds, as well as one industry fund called NGS Super, which took the step of divesting from undiversified oil and gas producers a couple of years ago. I've got a slide here, a tile here around Australian Super as well, because a couple of years ago, Australian Super bought up a huge stake in Woodside, and now is actually one of the company's top 5 shareholders and owns just north of a 5% stake in the company. So this is just a kind of a demonstration of the power of the super industry, right? And its ability to actually, drive the change that we need to see. I know I'm running out of time pretty quickly, so I won't dwell too much on this. But look, we worked with a whole bunch of different organizations and led a push to put some pressure on AusSuper to actually, as a big shareholder in Woodside, to take a stand and against the company's expansion plans. Now, I'll speak to the Woodside AGM in a sec, but look, the company, Australian Super ended up voting against Woodside's climate plan, which was good to see, of course, but the reality is Woodside put its climate plan to a vote a couple of years ago, which a lot of investors also rejected. And so that really is the absolute bare minimum this year. And we were expecting to see investors escalate further by voting against the re-election of the chair of the company, who was ultimately responsible for that climate plan. And so that actually, at that AGM, it was a pretty significant day. So look, there's an action shot of me in Perth a few months ago, asking a question of the board. And what we saw that day was a world record 58% of shareholders rejecting the company's climate plan. So that's the first time that a majority of shareholders have done that around the world. I'll say that Woodside actually broke its own world record here, because the second highest vote against a climate plan globally was Woodside's back in 2022. The company also the chair rather, copped a hugely embarrassing 17% vote against his re-election. Now, this is embarrassing for the company. It's one of the lowest votes against a sitting ASX 50 director in the past decade, and a pretty big sign that investors aren't happy with Woodside's progress. Now, we were quite disappointed that many investors, more investors didn't vote against the chair, because that is a pretty, that's a binding vote. That means that if the chair actually cops more than 50% against him or them, then then they're out. Whereas the climate plan is actually a non-binding advisory vote, which means that a lot of investors who voted against it were sending a signal to the company, but a signal that the company doesn't have to do anything about. And we saw a couple of years ago Woodside completely ignore the vote against its climate plan, as well as a pretty significant vote against one of its directors last year. And so, all in all, a significant day, but further action is clearly needed to actually try and turn this company around. And in terms of what's next for the company, so we've filed several what are called capital protection shareholder resolutions at Woodside in recent years. And what that means is we're asking for the company to disclose information about how it's going to align with a net zero or a Paris scenario, right? And what that means is actually delivering a plan to shareholders about how it's going to effectively cap and reduce its oil and gas production in alignment with global climate goals. And we actually had around 19% support for that resolution a couple of years back, which 19% is obviously well short of majority, but that's a pretty significant demonstration, because that's effectively a fifth of the company's shareholders telling the company to wind up its core business and and ensure to maintain shareholder value elsewhere. So we've seen some very big protest votes against Woodside in recent years, right? I mentioned the 49% vote against its climate plan a few years ago. We had 50% of shareholders voting for an advisory resolution on Scope 3 and capital expenditure alignment with the Paris Agreement. Big protest vote against the re-election of a director. And we've had no material progress from Woodside since 2020 on its climate strategy. And we also have large investors such as super funds failing to adequately increase pressure in response to Woodside's recalcitrance. So, as I said before, many of them had the opportunity to increase pressure further and vote against the chair this year, but instead a lot of them took the easy way out and just opted for a non-binding advisory vote once again. Now, super funds could be holding the credible threat of divestment over Woodside and actually making their escalation steps and plans public, but again, they're failing to do that, and so Woodside is just clearly not taking the hint and ignoring investors' concerns as it has been for years. So what's actually next here? What can or needs to happen, right? So for a company like Woodside, it has a few options. It needs to transition into an entirely new business. That's one option. It could undertake a capital return strategy, which means capping and reducing oil and gas production and returning capital to shareholders and winding up its business. Like, we don't know what's actually going to happen. We do know that shareholders are failing to adequately hold the company to account. But the only certainty here really is that the companies like these, that they just can't keep expanding production, right? Because that is a huge threat to a stable climate future, to the global economy more broadly, including super fund members' savings in the long term. And this means that inevitably companies like this need to reach a point where oil and gas production stops expanding and starts declining. And we know that must happen right now as we really are running out of time. So thanks very much for listening, everyone. Really appreciate that. I've just got my little list of sources here in case anyone's interested, but I'll hand back over to Christoph now.
Thanks so much, Brad. Appreciate it. So before we go to a more general open discussion and Q&A, we will have the two speakers each to comment and reflect on each other's talk for about 5 minutes each. And we will first have Saphira commenting and reflecting on Brad's talk. So,
thanks. A few thoughts that came to mind is, so there's a case against Woodside at the moment. I think Greenpeace is suing Woodside. The EDO, Environmental Defenders Office, one of my favorite organizations, I have to say, is suing them. And again, I actually don't know if we have to remove that actually from the recording, but I am an independent expert on that case. And it's actually not so easy. The companies are getting better and better at their reporting and justifying. It's not so they are being more and more cautious about saying, that they are Paris aligned, or and they are hiring people that know what they're talking about. Because when I was reviewing the Woodside report, it was very hard for me to quite easily pinpoint where they went wrong, or sort of, what was greenwashing, or saying that they are not aligned. So they basically claim, look, we have all these pathways. Many of these pathways will still include a lot of gas. And they basically argue, well, we're the most cost competitive ones to do this. So yeah, just saying that it's actually quite complex to, I guess, hold them accountable in court. Then there are more and more lawsuits globally. There's another one with Holcim, cement, globally significant cement company, on which I was also asked to write an independent report, and include the element of historical responsibility in there as well, which is not easy. Like, it's easy sort of to talk about, like, look, there's historical responsibility, but what that actually means in terms of, okay, what does that look like in terms of how much do they need to mitigate more going forward, right? We don't have these methods. I have a PhD student on that specific topic. How do we integrate equity into these pathways? But it's very complex. It's not easy to kind of do that. I guess the topic of divestment. So I'm quite often asked about divestment from a sort of financial perspective. I have changed my mind a little bit. I used to be, I think at the start, sort of, yeah, divest. There are issues with divestment. I still, I don't want to make a statement whether I'm pro or against divestment, but there are risks to, I was actually a few weeks ago, I came across, because I'm Airbnb my house at the moment, and there was someone in there that was on the board of a coal company saying, look, it's just all the Indonesians are now holding the shares. So it's like, divestment is only effective, and therefore there's still an argument to do it, is that, okay, if we need a significant amount of people to divest for it to have an effect. So that's one thing. And then engagement, and there are lots of risks to engagement, but we want the companies to transition, right? We want to either enter into different sort of areas, and shut down their assets, because just divesting doesn't necessarily ensure that. So I guess one of my resolutions to UniSuper was to disclose much more accurately how they are engaging with companies. So this engagement is actually really important, because if you can change these large incumbents, that would be, that would be great. Then another argument for divestment would be like that you could say, well, there's still the risk perspective. So even if there would be others that might be buying these assets, then they're exposed to the risk that if we are transitioning, there will be stranded assets. So there's still the risk perspective to do with divestment. And I think I wrote down this, like, just something you said, Brett, reminded me of, UniSuper, and I guess also the sort of systemic. It's easy to sort of like blame another party, like, oh, but the government, it's like saying, oh, but we are bound with the performance test and we have to do this over the next 3 years. Okay, what can you do to then go and say, look, this performance test is not working when we're talking about climate change. This is a long-term risk. So how can we, and it's also a little bit with the divestment, it does require the systemic sort of approach. So just to highlight that, we need all these different perspectives, also getting rid of the subsidies for fossil fuels, like all these things also need to happen, because the companies are to some extent constrained in what they can do. So, but that constraint, as long as they recognize that constraint, but then try and eliminate that constraint, because it's easy to say, look, I'm constrained. Look, I can't do this because I have like, I can't do this because then I won't make profit, or like, there's no carbon price, like all these things are not in place, so therefore I can't do this. Okay, then what are you going to do that you can do this? So I think that was something that I wanted to highlight. One more thing I wanted to highlight about UniSuper is there was also, when I was proposing the resolutions, there was someone else who proposed the resolutions that the climate metrics that they have on their report should be disclosed on the members' profile. So we are all with UniSuper, we all have a portal, and we can see our investment performance. And there was a resolution saying that also climate metrics should be displayed on our portal. That actually got a 50% vote, which is a total miracle. But I think, I don't know how many weeks or months ago, because I can't keep track, there was an email saying that, okay, despite there being it was like 50.2% or something, so technical majority, they've chosen not to do it. And that comes back to, I think, what Brett was saying before, like some of these are actually just symbolic and the company doesn't actually have to do something even when there's a majority vote. Still not saying that it's not super important, but, you know, that is a limitation. I think that's all I wanted to share on this.
Okay, now we can give it to Brett.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Saphira. And yeah, again, great presentation. I might start with, actually, if it's okay, yeah, like responding to some of those points you raised as well, and then launch into my sort of thoughts on your presentation as well, Saphira. So yeah, the point around divestment and engagement, I think, is a really important one, and something that has been an ongoing debate for quite some time. I think the important part is that, you know, a lot of divestment cops, a lot of pushback on the grounds that, yeah, people say that, look, oh, I'm selling the shares on a secondary market that is going to someone else, a less scrupulous investor, or, you know, they're talking about it as if it's kind of diametrically opposed to engagement. But the reality is it's part of a toolkit like every other stewardship tool, and also doesn't need to be the endpoint, right? Like we've seen some European pension funds, you know, clearly laying out their escalation pathways with companies, and they go, we're going to get out of this particular subsector unless these companies can demonstrate they're Paris-aligned by this point. And they have a clear escalation strategy that includes things like, you know, public statements, you know, voting against board directors. And then they say, if they haven't changed by X date, then we're out. But that isn't the end of it. You know, they say, if this company does actually change, we can get back in. And so it's really important to acknowledge that, you know, the divestment engagement kind of debate is often oversimplified, and I think it's which is quite damaging. And so and because of that, you know, the symbolic power of a mass flight of capital from these damaging companies is ignored. You know, it's not about the individual sale of those shares. It's about long-term investors going, hey, you know, these companies pose too big a risk. We've tried to change them. They're not changing. So we're getting out. And look, on the engagement front as well, wholeheartedly agree. Like, it's something that should and could be used to change companies. But the reality is big investors they're just not doing it. You know, what's that that aphorism around, you know, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result, right? Like continuously making non-binding votes against a company, especially a company as recalcitrant as Woodside, is not going to change anything. So we need to see significantly increased pressure and on companies like that to change. Now on to your presentation, Saphira. So yeah, thanks again. That was brilliant. I really loved, again, going back to the basic, like the fundamentals of finance. Like, I didn't do a finance degree or anything, but, you know, over the years have developed a little bit of a knowledge about it, especially working at market forces. Something that really stuck out to me as well is you know, that concept of you know, the time value of money, and how you know, we're valuing, like, basically, like, you know, if we're making an investment decision, then we're valuing money different in the future than we are today. It's quite interesting when you know, that's applied to climate change, right? And so you know, in a way, like, climate change is the ultimate environmental externality. Like, it's going to impact the entire economy, and because of that, I think that, you know, for companies that are exacerbating climate risk, such as big institutional investors, they should be, or have a duty really, to pull out every stop to address that risk. And so I've like read a little bit of work on climate economics in the past, and you know, in particular looking at Keynes' criticisms of Nordhaus's model, and how you know, the discount rate that's being applied to to the future damages caused by climate change, effectively means that we're valuing the lives of people in the future much less than today. And like that is unfortunately a downfall of neoclassical economics. But really, I think it's fantastic that you're doing this work to actually sort of unpick that and go and sort of look at how what Paris alignment actually means for certain companies, and how as every year that passes, the ambition of that pathway needs to increase, because, as you said, emissions are cumulative, right? Each year that passes, it becomes more urgent to actually to reduce emissions. And so, I find that quite fascinating. Another thing I found quite interesting as well is just given your comment around the TCFD and being launched back in 2017, and well, their recommendations anyway, and how not to panic about that. And I was like, yeah, like absolutely. Didn't get any heart flutters or anything. You'd be glad to hear. But well, one thing that I really think is quite jarring though is that given that was back in 2017, and we have since seen an uptake in climate-related financial disclosures globally and the development of various standards, but I still find it quite jarring that the investors in particular are like focused on or chasing disclosure from certain companies when there are actually examples of sectors where it's very clear where the issue lies, right? Like an analysis, I think by the IISD of a variety of credible 1.5-degree pathways has demonstrated unequivocally that there is no room for new oil and gas fields in those pathways, right? Now, you mentioned before as well that the likes of Woodside and other companies make it really difficult to actually hold them to account for erroneous claims in a legal capacity. But because they're often relying on claims where I think Woodside in its latest climate report mentioned that it's relying on a certain subset of 1.5 pathways. But the average of those pathways to be Paris aligned, and for that, their claims about gas demand in those scenarios would mean that carbon capture and storage capacity, currently operating and planned, that is, would need to increase 48 times by 2050, which is just a next to impossible scenario, right? Like the one of the biggest CCS facilities and also biggest failures actually is Chevron's Gorgon facility in WA, which is capturing way less than it actually, that it sets out to. And that would mean under these scenarios that Woodside's talking about, that would mean building 3 new Gorgon-sized facilities every week between now and 2050. So these are the bases upon which fossil fuel companies are claiming to be Paris aligned, which is clearly a pipe dream, so to speak. So look, I think it's really quite concerning that a lot of investors in particular are focused on disclosure for companies like that, when we know that their Scope 3 emissions are around 90% of their overall emissions profile, and it's pretty clear what needs to be done. But again, I thank you for doing this work in in understanding what, like, each different sector and what's required, because it's especially as time goes on and things become more urgent. I think I've got a lot to say, and maybe it's more of a conversation we can have afterwards, Saphira, because I'd love to chat to you more about this, but don't want to take up too much more time, and or especially valuable time for any questions that folks might have. So I might hand it back over to you, Christoph or Saphira.
Yeah, thanks both of you. That was great. So now we go to questions, and let's start with the one that's already asked in the chat. So we have Winifred, who asked, I want to know what it would take for some of the externalities to be attributed to the fossil fuel companies known to cause them. How can fossil fuel companies be made financially responsible for Australians? High insurance costs, and how can their directors be made criminally responsible for example, via industrial manslaughter for flood and fire death. So any of you who wants to go
This
first?
is a question for the EDO, like the the climate lawyers. Like, I know that there are cases that is particularly assigning climate damages, yes, to specific companies. So that's the attribution, I think they call it the attribution science. So Richard Hede has done some work on that. He has a few papers on that. I'm not sure if they're of much use, but I know that they are not so sure about the higher insurance costs. That's an interesting angle. Yeah, that's all I have. Brett?
Yeah, I think my answer is pretty much the same as yours, Saphira. I think the EDO or other groups like that are probably great to talk to. Yeah, that I do know there is some work being done on the attribution science, but I just don't know enough about it because it's emerging and it is certainly outside my field of knowledge. But I think it is an important one because as time goes on and we are as a movement or as a country or a nation state or a globe, successful in pushing the industry to wind down. There are going to be less and less projects out there and less companies pursuing them, and so over time it will probably become easier to attribute climate impacts to specific companies or sectors. So.
And this ties into the litigation risk of, this all ties into part of that transition risk, which is, so it's really important that I think these different angles of like, how do we create that risk, right? So moving to actually a Paris-aligned world is, requires these type of litigation cases. It's all tying into creating the financial risk for companies, because if there's no threat of this financial risk, and it also ties into reputation, right? If people start hearing, oh, actually, this is causing my, insurance to go up, like, so I think it's very good comment, Winifred. I see, do you want me
to... so we also have a comment by Savannah Wilson, which is, what about Australian ethical super? Are they as beneficial for the environment as they claim?
Question for Brett.
Wonderful. But yeah, thanks for your question, Savannah. I was actually just typing a response to that in the chat, but I'll gladly take the opportunity to speak it instead. So look, Australian Ethical has comprehensive fossil fuel exclusion screens applied across the whole fund. So what I'll actually do is I can pop a link in the chat to we've got a resource on our website called our super funds table, which we profile the largest or the default investment options of Australia's biggest super funds, and also include that small group of ethical funds as well. And we look at their coal, oil and gas exclusion policies, as well as their investments in the Climate Rekkers Index companies as well. And I'll pop this link in here shortly, but you'll see that Oz Ethical has comprehensive fossil fuel screens, and also no exposure to any of those 190 climate wreckers as well. The other important thing to note as well is that there are I guess within the ethical funds, right, and also the sort of broader debate around ethical investing, there's a lot of super funds, when they implement screens, they'll take what's called a rules-based approach, which is where they go, we will exclude companies that derive, by way of like one example, which is called a revenue threshold. Companies will say, we'll exclude or not invest in companies that derive more than X% of their revenue from a particular industry. But then, which can quite easily rule out entire industries or sectors. But then there are also others that other companies that might provide significant services to those companies as well. So a good example of that is I'm not sure of the exact institutions, but I know that like Oz Ethical, for example, invests in some of the big banks in Australia, which are still financing or providing corporate finance to fossil fuel companies. I know that they are actually taking some strong engagement steps with those banks to try and get them to stop that. But there are other ethical funds out there, like Future Super, for example, that doesn't invest in the banks, you know. So there's a lot of nuance to all of this. But overall, yeah, a lot of those funds are ruling out direct investment in companies that are expanding fossil fuels and even those that are building fossil fuel infrastructure and significant services, etc.
Just a quick comment on fossil fuels, tying back to what you were saying earlier, like the disclosures and everything is great, but we can already evaluate them. That's why we actually in our paper just focus on their production and not so much on their emissions, because that's not what they report. But I think it's also important to acknowledge that, and this was surrounding my resolutions with UniSuper as well, is that we just need a full stop assessment of more sectors as well, because power generation, right, like it's if we were to divest from all the companies that are not Paris aligned, we probably would be left with only like 2 companies, and if we all put our money on all those companies, that's not going to do anything either, right? So it is also important to look at these other sectors as well.
Okay. Do we have any more questions, and particularly on Zoom, where the majority of our audience is? So yeah, I guess I also have one question, which was, so I really enjoyed where you talked about the trade-off between divesting and also changing from within. And I was just wondering, I guess, like, when is divesting maybe the better option? So I'm thinking about kind of companies that are like fully focused on fossil fuels. I mean, there are many companies, it's all about extracting coal or oil or gas. Like, how much is it realistic to change from within if the entire company is about extracting fossil fuels?
Brett, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Chris. A very, very big question that we could spend a lot of time discussing the nuances of, I think. But look, overall, I mean, yeah, as I mentioned before, divestment is a part of any investor's toolkit. It's a way of saying, I can't, this company isn't taking on board or addressing the concerns that I've raised or the risks. And so investors will often say, where the risks are too great with respect to a particular company, they'll divest. But where it becomes a bit complicated in terms of climate change is that climate change is a systemic risk. It'll impact the whole economy. And so the risks that are being posed or exacerbated by fossil fuel companies through their expansion plans and the emissions associated, the argument against divestment is that, well, if we just get out of those companies, they're just going to still keep doing that, and therefore the risks to the economy are going to grow. And again, if they sell those shares onto the secondary market and someone else buys them, that might be an investor with no climate claims or commitments, or it wouldn't even care about climate change at all, right? But conversely, you can also make the argument that, well, actually, while you're holding these shares, you're actually just profiting off of climate destruction and these companies' continued expansion plans and the emissions, while also failing to prevent them from doing that. So, if for like super funds, for example, have been telling their members for years that they engage with these companies and that's their preferred option to clean them up. But as I stressed in my presentation, they are absolutely failing to do that. Super funds are just not taking the required steps to actually bring these companies into line with the global energy transition. And so, there does have to be a point where divestment becomes an option, and even the credible threat of divestment, right? To say, look, if a big investor comes out and says, we're going to get out of Woodside unless Woodside, changes course, that has, like companies, like the market, the stock market in Australia is quite concentrated, right? There are a handful of big companies that make up the majority of the market. And so if a big investor says we're going to get out, that could actually have significant ramifications. And there are, consequences and regulations that investors need to abide by in terms of their impact on the market. But really, divestment is something that has to be on the table. And as I said before as well, it also doesn't necessarily need to be the end point. If Woodside doesn't change and its investors start walking away, then if Woodside all of a sudden turns around and goes, actually, we're going to return our capital to shareholders, or we're going to transition the business, or whatever it is, then there's an option for shareholders to actually re-engage at that point. The other important thing to note is that we've already seen the impact of divestment in Australia in certain ways. Like, we saw a lot of the very first super fund back in 2014 put an exclusion on coal companies. Right? Like, since then, we've seen a lot of other super funds excluding coal. That has impacts, across the broader market, whereby the debt financiers of coal companies sort of perk up and go, hey, we've seen some big long-term investors walking away from coal. They start to question their own financial support for those companies. And right now, Australia is one of the biggest coal mining companies in Australia. None of the big four banks are financing it. A lot of super funds are out, and Whitehaven Coal has had to head overseas chasing really expensive finance from Wall Street banks to continue expanding, which increases sort of like the cost risks for investors. So yeah, I'll leave it there and give you an opportunity to jump in, Saphira, but I hope that at least gives you a bit of a scratches the surface a little bit, Christoph.
Yeah.
It's 12 o'clock, so
Yeah.
maybe we should wrap up, but no, I will leave it at this.
Okay. Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time, but thanks so much. And please join me in thanking Saphira and Brett. Thanks so much. So I just want to, at the end, just announce or talk about briefly our next PEPSS seminar, because it will be at a different time as usual. So it will be in August the 29th, also on climate change, and it will be hosted by ANU. That's why it will be on a Thursday, and it also will be from 4 to 5 p.m. So please keep a lookout on the emails we send out, and yeah, hopefully you will also join us at our next seminar. And yeah, thanks so much, and have a good day and weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.